Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Breaking into the tomb of King Edward I. Often considered one of the greatest English medieval kings, Edward I was known as the Hammer of the Scots. He was a large and intimidating man who inspired fear in his subordinates, and he was held in great respect as not just a king, but as a military leader and soldier. He was responsible also for a full-scale conquest of Wales, and he established English rule and built a huge number of castles which were settled in by English people. He was so well respected that he was brought into arbitrate disputes between the claimants to the Scottish throne. He ruled England for around 35 years, but following his death, 400 years later, his remains were tampered with, and his coffin was opened by a curious dean of Westminster Abbey. Still today, his tomb can be seen inside of the abbey. But what's the story of the breaking into the tomb of Edward I? The death of Edward I was not a shock, and it had been coming as his health progressively got worse over the last 3 years of his life. He suffered from a painful and prolonged illness, and throughout 1306 and in the early part of 1307, the king's household made a number of purchases of foreign medicine, ointments and even leather leggings to help keep away some of his problems and pains. His legs were often dealt with, and he wore compression tights also, and he also had a neck brace made. Edward I suffered with aching joints, which were very painful, and he often also took herbal baths and drank pomegranate wine, and a cordial which was made from crushed amber, musk, pearls, gold and silver. His health would go up and down, and some months he'd be mobile, but others he would be carried around. He would manage to inspect his soldiers on the border for a final campaign in Scotland, and despite the threat of his death, he refused to give in. The final years of his life were dominated by war in Gascony and Scotland. Throughout the first 7 years of the 14th century, Edward fought for control over a divided Scotland and declared himself its king. He considered Scotland part of England and his kingdom, and he took advantage of squabbling Scottish barons to seize control himself. Often there were Scottish counter-revolts, and this resulted in English campaigns north of the border, but still the king was very ill. He must have known death was on the horizon, and he continued to assault his enemies in a brutal way. He would have many of Robert the Bruce's brothers executed, along with other earls, and he even ordered Bruce's wife, daughter and sister to be hunted down and held in prisons and convents, and 2 of them were even held inside cages in the rooms of Roxburgh and Berwick Castle. It's even been suggested that these cages were suspended over the castle walls, with exposure plaguing the women, with the snow and rain lashing down on them. But these rumours more than back up Edward's brutal reputation. Edward I was keen to bring Robert the Bruce to his knees, and at the start of July 1307 he assembled an army further north. But the king would contract dysentery during this, and by the time the army reached Borough by Sands, Edward was resting in his bed. However, early the following day, Edward's servants entered his chambers to wake up the king, and as they lifted him from his bed, he fell back in their arms. The English king was dead, and the news of the king's death was kept quiet to ensure that the enemy would not know, and that the English would not desert his cause. Letters were sent south to one of the oldest and most loyal earls and servants of the king, and another letter was sent to Edward's second wife, and following this, Edward of Carnarvon then received the news at Westminster, and he then claimed his birthright and was crowned King Edward II. Edward I's body was sent south, where it arrived at Waltham Abbey in Essex, and was laid in state. Vigils were held here, and prayers were said for his body, and preparations were made for the funeral by September. By mid-October, the king's body was moved from Waltham Abbey to the monastery of the Holy Trinity, before it eventually went to St. Paul's. It was then moved to Westminster Abbey for the funeral, which was conducted the following day. A solemn ceremony was held for the king, and Edward I was laid to rest wearing his coronation robes, which included a red silk tunic, a cloth of gold on the lower garments, a crown was placed on his head, and the sceptre was placed in his hands, marking his royal state. He was then interred in a plain black Purbeck marble tomb, and there was no ornate effigy placed on top of it. In the 16th century, the inscription "Edward I, Hammer of the Scots is here" was added, but the tomb was very plain despite his status. It is believed that this may have been at the request of Edward I himself, as there are accounts that he had said that he wished for his body to be boiled down to bones after his death, which would have been very rough. This was so that his bones could be taken on a return journey to the Holy Land on a crusade, and this may be why the tomb was kept plain, meaning it was easy for people to obtain his remains and body to then boil it down when the moment came. But this showed you the true warrior spirit of Edward I. However, in 1774, Edward I's tomb was opened by the Society of Antiquaries. They had been given permission by the Dean of Westminster. The stone on his tomb was just resting on the rest of the tomb, meaning that it was not properly sealed, and they must have done this to allow easier access to his bones. Inside was the king's stone coffin, which was placed on top of a fine layer of rubble. His body was found wrapped in a cerecloth, which had wax soaked on the inside, which was touching the king's skin. The crown was still on the king's head, but when the waxy cloth was pulled away, the king's body was revealed, and over his face was a decaying red silk. The king was found to have been 6 feet 2 inches tall, giving credence to his nickname of Longshanks, meaning tall or long-limbed. His body was incredibly preserved, as the low humidity and coolness of the air had kept Edward's body in good condition. This means that chances are that the remains of other kings and queens resting nearby in the abbey are also possibly well preserved. Edward I's body was found dressed in a red silk damask tunic, with a stole of thick white tissue around his chest, which was set with gilt and semi-precious stones. He was wearing a royal mantle of crimson satin, and a cloth of gold lay from the waist down. In his right hand was a sceptre with a cross of copper gilt, and in his left hand was a 5-foot rod with a white enamel dove. As mentioned, he wore a gilt metal crown, and his hands and feet were intact. It was said of his body, the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard, and a sinking or dip between the chin and upper lip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short, as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on the part of the bridge of the nose which separates the orbits of the eyes, and some globular substance, possibly fleshy part of the eyeballs, was movable in the sockets under the envelope. King Edward I was buried almost in the coronation robes which he may have worn when he became king, and this is similar to what royalty wear today on their coronation. He was a brilliant king who would have been a constant thorn in the sides of the Scottish and also the Welsh, and he was a conquesting king. However, when his coffin was opened over 400 years after his death, his body was found in a remarkable state, and with this it's unbelievable to think that there are many other kings and queens buried nearby in sealed tombs that may very well be preserved. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.